Good afternoon. My name is Larry Lyons. I've been giving some talks about places we've seen and places we've visited. And today I'm going to talk about the Battle of Jutland, which was the greatest sea battle in history up to that time. But first I'd like to say a few words about the First World War. I've been interested in the First World War since I read Barbara Tuchman's book, The Guns of August, in 1960. It's a great book, and that's led to my reading and research, which eventually culminated in a book I recently published on the First World War. The First World War is my special area of historic interest. And I'm delighted to be able to talk about it today. Not entirely, but just the key sea battle that took place in the First World War. Just a few words about the First War. When you think of it, the First World War was the cataclysmic event of the 20th century. It led to the dissolution of 4 of the 5 empires of Europe. Only the British Empire survived the war. It led to the Russian Revolution, and since we've been to St. Petersburg, we know how much happened there. It led to the independence of Estonia and Finland. Both of those countries were part of Russia until the First War and the Russian Revolution. But more ominously, it led to the rise of Hitler. Hitler, as many of you probably know, was a corporal in the German army. And he was gassed, and he had a pretty miserable life up until the time he joined the German army. It was very important to him. And he was gassed, and he was in the hospital, and when the news of the defeat of the armistice came forward, and he was devastated. And as we all know, he's a spellbinding speaker, and he was able, with a lot of help, to convince the German people that the German army was not defeated in the First World War. It was stabbed in the back by the Jews. And he harped on this theme for 10 years or more, and then he became German Chancellor in 1933. So, no First World War, no Hitler. No First World War, no Russian Revolution. No Second World War, no Cold War. All of which came out of the First World War. It was the true defining cataclysmic event of the 20th century. Not to say that other bad things could have happened, but the First World War did happen, and it had a devastating effect on Europe, and in fact on the whole world. Something to keep in mind. Jutland is a naval battle that occurred on May 31st, 1916. And why did it happen? Well, it was not at all clear when the war began that Britain would be involved in it. In fact, a very distinguished historian, Neil Ferguson, recently wrote a book called A Pity of War, in which he hypothesized that the British did not declare war, and what would have happened then. Very interesting book. It's called Counterfactual History, which is semi-respectable among historians, but in the hands of a competent historian like this man, Neil Ferguson, it's an absolutely fascinating study in a possible future for Europe without Britain's involvement. Why did the British get involved? During the 19th century, many European nations made a grab for colonies. The Belgians took the Congo, the French conquered much of Africa. The United States took the Philippines. Germany was the most powerful in terms of gross national product, in terms of production of steel, in terms of its army, the most powerful nation in Europe. And so Admiral von Tirpitz convinced the Kaiser, the leader of Germany, that Germany should have colonies. Well, when one has colonies, and they did develop, there's several colonies in Africa and in the Far East, etc. To support colonies, to be able to defend them, you needed a fleet. So Tirpitz convinced the Kaiser that he had to build a fleet. The prospect of a nation as powerful as Germany building a fleet to challenge the British was very, very disturbing to the British. The British are a maritime nation. They have never had a big army, but they depend on their navy to defend the island and to support their commerce and defend the commerce. So the British, who had a policy, really, their navy had to be stronger than the two next most powerful navies in the world. They had a deliberate government policy to do this. When Germany started building battleships, which were the key capital ship meaning the main ship of a navy. Now it's the aircraft carrier, but at that time it was the battleship. When Germany started building battleships, they had to build them. And they adopted a policy every time Germany would build one, they would build two. So, what normally the British had not had a particular quarrel with Germany. Its main enemy, really, in the 19th century was France. But the fact that the Germans attempted to challenge them on the seas, and very disturbing to their strategic position, they could not tolerate that. And so the public opinion, which in Britain had largely been, if you will, apathetic or not particularly caring about the Germans, all of a sudden was not. And so there's a great enmity built up in the British population, of course the British leadership, that Germany had to be at least, Britain had to be at least as strong and hopefully much stronger than Germany, especially at sea. In Britain, to this day, they call World War I not World War I, they call it the Great War, because of the absolute terrible effect it had on the loss of young men, loss of national treasure, and it led, as we all know, to a Great Depression later on. Why is World War I a world war? Food for thought. It was because the British were involved. Because the British Empire, the sun never set on the British Empire. The British had interest in India. The British had interest elsewhere in the Far East. The British had interest in Africa. And they were everywhere. And any time there was an issue with Britain being involved, it meant that it was a worldwide conflict by definition. So the first, of course, they didn't call it the First World War. They didn't know it was going to be the second. But they call it the Great War because it was easily the biggest war that had ever been seen on the European continent. Ferguson basically says that it was a European war, and there was no good reason for the British to become involved. But I think on balance it was a good thing, because the French and the Russians would never defeated Germany by themselves. Well, here we are. We're in the North Sea. This body of water between Britain, Norway, Denmark, and the coast of France and the Benelux countries. It was the battleground for the fleets of the First World War. And there were two engagements. There was a minor one in 1914, a bigger one at the Battle of the Dogger Bank, which is a shallow bank in the North Sea. And the biggest by far was Jutland. That's about right in terms of its position. We're south, and I think right now to the slightly to the west. There's another thing on the map that is of interest. The British actually, in 1918, they laid a barrier of mines between Norway and the Orkneys, which is their possession. And that was to try to stop the submarines. Because after Jutland, Germany never attempted another major fleet action and relied on submarines to win the war for them. It had the unanticipated consequence, of course, of bringing the United States into the war in 1917, which guaranteed their defeat. What strategy did the British have? They had a much greater fleet. You'll see the numbers in a minute. They had a much greater fleet than the Germans in terms of capital ships, in terms of battleships. It was obviously very much to their advantage to have two prize fighters in the ring, because they were the biggest prize fighter. If they could meet the German Navy in the North Sea, they had twice as many battleships as the Germans did, and they had trained for this, for 10 or 15 years. They knew what they were going to do. They had conducted all kinds of fleet maneuvers to figure out what to do and to how to best use their heavy guns. And so their strategy was to determine when the high seas fleet, which is the German fleet, when it was at sea. And I'll tell you how that was done. But in order to execute this strategy, they had to know when the German fleet was at sea. And they did. And I'll show you why. But before I do that, here's the relative strengths of the fleet. And there are a few things on that chart that need a little bit of explanation. You notice that they call the first line of the chart says dreadnought battleships. Well, what does that mean? Going back a little bit, the Japanese defeated the Russian Baltic Fleet in 1905 at the Battle of Tsushima. It was the greatest sea battle up until that time. And there were, of course, British observers. It was common for British and German officers to be serving on the various fleets to observe what was going on in sea warfare, because one thing about sea warfare, you don't know what's going to work until you're in a battle. Well, at Tsushima, it was very clear that the greatest damage that were inflicted on ships were by the primary armament. In other words, if a ship had a 15-inch gun, which meant that the bore, the size of the muzzle of the gun was 15 inches, and 6-inch armament, which meant it was 6-inch wide, it was the big guns that did the damage, not the little ones. The little ones did not have the range of the big guns. The big guns would throw a shell weighing as much as a ton. And so the Lord Fisher, who was the Chief Sea Lord of the British Navy in 1905, conceived of a ship that would be all big gun. It actually is what any modern battleship, if you see pictures of the Missouri or the Prince of Wales. But it's a gun platform for heavy guns. And it was called HMS Dreadnought. And overnight, when it was launched in 1905, revolutionized naval ship design, made all previous battleships obsolete. So the key element of the fleet was the dreadnought battleships. The British had almost twice as many dreadnought battleships as the Germans did.